I've watched Washington make promises for 50 years now, and I've learned something. When a president talks about sending money directly to the people, you'd better understand what's really happening beneath the surface. Here's what matters right now. The conversation around new stimulus payments in 2026 isn't just political theater. It's connected to real pressures facing Social Security and retirement income. Trump's proposal comes at a peculiar moment. Social Security's trust fund is projected to face depletion by 2033. Inflation has eroded purchasing power by roughly 18% since 2020, and millions of retirees are discovering their fixed incomes don't stretch like they used to. Now here's where most people get it wrong. They hear stimulus check and think it's simple. Free money from a generous government. But the mechanics tell a different story. Any new payment program intersects with existing Social Security benefits, Medicare funding, and tax policy in ways that create winners and losers. Some proposals would provide direct relief, but potentially accelerate trust fund depletion. Others might offer one-time payments while adjusting cost of living calculations that affect your monthly check for years to come. The question isn't whether you'll get a check. The question is, what does accepting it cost you in the long run? Let me tell you something I learned from decades of watching money flow through systems. Nothing in government finance happens in isolation, and that's especially true when we're talking about sending checks to 70 million Social Security recipients. When Trump floated this idea about new stimulus payments targeted at seniors and retirees, my first instinct wasn't to ask how much. It was to ask why now, and what's the second-order consequence that nobody's talking about. See, here's what happens when you've lived through enough economic cycles. You start recognizing patterns. In 2020 and 2021, we saw stimulus checks go out to almost every American, and yes, they provided immediate relief during an unprecedented shutdown. But what followed? We got the highest inflation in 40 years, and ironically, the people who got hurt the worst were the very seniors living on fixed incomes that these new proposals claim to help. Their stimulus check might have been $1,200 or $1,400, but their grocery bills went up by $3,000 a year. Their utility costs surged. Their prescription drugs cost more even with Medicare Part D. The math didn't work in their favor, and that's a crucial lesson that seems to get forgotten every time election season rolls around. Now, the current proposal differs in important ways, and we need to understand the specifics. What's being discussed isn't a universal payment to all Americans. It's targeted relief for Social Security recipients, particularly those over a certain age threshold or below certain income limits. The amounts being mentioned range anywhere from $1,500 to $3,000 per recipient, with some versions of the proposal including married couples receiving combined payments. On the surface, for someone living on $1,600 a month from Social Security, an extra $2,000 sounds like a meaningful boost. That's their total monthly income plus some extra. That could pay for dental work that Medicare doesn't cover, or catch up on property taxes, or fix a car that's essential in areas without public transportation. But here's where we need to think like investors, not like politicians making promises. Where does this money come from? The federal government is already running deficits of roughly $2 trillion annually. Social Security itself is paying out more than it takes in through payroll taxes, drawing down its trust fund reserves. If we send out stimulus payments totaling anywhere from $100 to $200 billion to seniors, and that's a conservative estimate, we're adding that to the deficit. Now, you might say, so what? The government borrows money all the time, and you'd be right. But borrowed money has consequences, especially for the exact population we're trying to help. Think about the mechanism here. When the government borrows heavily, it competes for capital in the bond market. That puts upward pressure on interest rates. Higher interest rates mean several things happen simultaneously. First, the government's own interest payments on existing debt go up, which means less money available for actual programs. Second, it makes borrowing more expensive for everyone. Businesses invest less, housing becomes less affordable, economic growth potentially slows. Third, and this is crucial for retirees, higher interest rates typically correlate with the Federal Reserve fighting inflation, which means the purchasing power of fixed incomes continues to erode. You see the problem? We give seniors $2,000 today, But if that contributes to an inflationary environment where their cost of living goes up by 5 or 6% instead of 3%, we've actually made them poorer over any reasonable time horizon. Now, I'm not saying stimulus payments are inherently bad policy. Context matters enormously. During the pandemic, when we literally shut down the economy and prevented people from working, direct payments made sense as a bridge. But in 2026, we're talking about a different situation entirely. Unemployment is relatively low, the economy is functioning, and the primary challenges facing seniors are structural, not temporary. They're dealing with healthcare costs that rise faster than general inflation, housing expenses that have increased dramatically, and Social Security benefits that, even with cost of living adjustments, haven't kept pace with real expenses in categories that matter most to elderly Americans. Here's something most analysis misses. The Social Security cost of living adjustment formula uses the Consumer Price Index for urban wage earners, the CPIW. But seniors don't spend money like urban wage earners. They spend proportionally more on health care, on prescription drugs, on utilities because they're home more, on property taxes and insurance. The actual inflation rate experienced by a 75-year-old in Ohio is significantly different from what the official statistics capture. Some economists estimate the real inflation rate for seniors runs 1 to 2 percentage points higher than the headline numbers. That means every year they're falling further behind. And a one-time stimulus check, no matter how large, doesn't solve that structural problem. Let's talk about the political economy of this proposal, because that tells us a lot about what's likely to actually happen. Trump has a history of supporting direct payments. He insisted his name appear on the stimulus checks during his first term, understanding the political value of visible, tangible relief. For seniors specifically, this is smart coalition building. Older Americans vote at much higher rates than younger demographics, and they're a crucial swing constituency in states like Florida, Pennsylvania, Arizona, and Michigan. A proposal for senior-specific stimulus checks polls extremely well because it feels targeted and fair. These are people who worked their entire lives, paid into the system, and are now struggling. The optics are much better than broad-based stimulus that goes to everyone regardless of need. But here's what should concern you. When policy gets driven primarily by electoral calculations rather than sound economic analysis, you get programs that feel good in the moment but create long-term problems. I've seen this pattern repeatedly throughout my life. Politicians promise immediate benefits and downplay or ignore the costs that show up years later. And with Social Security, those future costs aren't abstract. They're mathematical certainties. The trust fund is projected to be depleted by 2033, at which point, under current law, benefits would be cut by approximately 23% across the board unless Congress acts. Every dollar we spend on stimulus checks today is a dollar we're not using to shore up Social Security's long-term finances. Now, some proponents argue that stimulus payments and Social Security reform are separate issues, that we can do both. Theoretically, that's true. But politically and practically, I'm skeptical. Major entitlement reform requires political capital, painful choices, and bipartisan cooperation. If Congress passes a popular stimulus payment program for seniors, it relieves some of the immediate political pressure to address Social Security's solvency. Why would legislators take the heat for raising the retirement age, increasing the payroll tax cap, or adjusting benefit formulas when they've just sent everyone a check? The stimulus becomes a substitute for real reform, not a complement to it. There's another angle worth considering: means testing and program design. If these stimulus payments are truly targeted at seniors who need them most, how do we define that? Is it based on Social Security income alone, total household income, assets? Each approach creates different incentives and different inequities. Someone who was prudent, saved money, and has a modest retirement account might get excluded, while someone who spent everything and has only Social Security qualifies. That creates a penalty for exactly the behavior we should encourage: personal responsibility and long-term planning. On the other hand, if we don't means test and send checks to every Social Security recipient regardless of wealth, we're sending government money to people who genuinely don't need it, which is wasteful and harder to justify fiscally. I keep coming back to a fundamental principle that served me well in business and investing: solve the right problem. The problem facing American seniors isn't that they need a one-time injection of cash. It's that their ongoing expenses exceed their ongoing income, and that gap is widening. A stimulus check addresses a symptom, not the disease. What would actually help? Reforming Medicare to cover dental, vision, and hearing, which are currently excluded and cost seniors thousands annually. Changing the Social Security COLA formula to reflect actual senior spending patterns, creating incentives for affordable senior housing in areas with good health care access, reducing prescription drug costs through real negotiation leverage, not just token adjustments. These are harder, more complex solutions that don't fit on a campaign postcard, but they're what actually moves the needle. Let me address something that might be on your mind. Aren't I being too cynical? Too negative about a policy that could genuinely help people who are struggling? Here's my response. I believe in helping people, but I believe in helping them effectively, not performatively. I've watched too many well-intentioned programs create unintended consequences because nobody thought through the second and third order effects. When you're dealing with the financial security of elderly Americans who have limited ability to adjust or recover from policy mistakes, you have an obligation to be rigorous in your analysis, even if it makes you unpopular. Consider the inflation risk more carefully. The stimulus payments in 2020 and 2021 totaled roughly $800 billion to households. The Federal Reserve expanded its balance sheet by trillions. Predictably, inflation spiked. Now the economy is in a different place, and a $150 billion stimulus program for seniors alone wouldn't have the same aggregate demand impact as the pandemic-era programs. But it's not zero either, and here's what matters. We're already in an environment where inflation has been sticky, where the Fed is trying to maintain price stability, and where any additional deficit spending adds to inflationary pressure. For seniors on fixed incomes, even modest inflation is devastating. A 3% inflation rate means they lose half their purchasing power over 23 years. A 5% rate, they lose half in just 14 years. These aren't abstract numbers. They determine whether someone can afford to stay in their home, buy adequate nutrition, or access health care. There's also the question of timing and implementation. Government programs, even simple ones like sending checks, take time to design, legislate, and execute. Remember the initial stimulus payments in 2020? The infrastructure wasn't really set up for it, and there were significant delays, people who fell through the cracks, incorrect amounts, payments sent to deceased individuals. If a new stimulus program for seniors is announced in 2026, when would payments actually arrive? How would eligibility be verified? Would it be automatic for everyone receiving Social Security, or would people need to apply? These details matter enormously for people living paycheck to paycheck, or in this case, Social Security check to Social Security check. I want to talk about opportunity cost because this concept is crucial and often overlooked. Every dollar spent on stimulus checks is a dollar not spent on something else, or more accurately, it's a dollar added to the national debt that future taxpayers will service. What else could we do with $150 billion? We could fully fund Meals on Wheels for decades, a program that costs about $1 billion annually and serves millions of homebound seniors. We could dramatically expand LIHEAP, the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program, which helps seniors afford heating and cooling and is chronically underfunded. We could increase funding for area agencies on aging that provide critical services like transportation, adult daycare, and caregiver support. These programs have proven track records and serve the seniors who need help most, yet they operate on shoestring budgets while we contemplate sending checks to everyone over 65 regardless of need. Here's something else that troubles me about the political discourse around this. It treats seniors as a monolithic group with identical needs and circumstances, which is nonsense. A 65-year-old recent retiree with a pension, paid-off house, and healthy savings is in a completely different situation than an 85-year-old widow living alone on a $900 Social Security check in an apartment with rising rent. A stimulus check of $2,000 is meaningful to the latter and barely noticeable to the former, yet many proposals would send payments to both. That's not good policy. It's lazy policy that prioritizes political simplicity over actual effectiveness. I also think about the message this sends about personal responsibility and the social contract. Social Security was designed as insurance, not welfare. You pay in during your working years. You receive benefits in retirement based on your earnings history. It's a compact between generations. When we start layering on additional payments that aren't tied to contributions, we're fundamentally changing that compact. Now, maybe that change is justified. Maybe we decide that the original Social Security benefit levels are inadequate and need supplementing. But let's be honest about what we're doing and have a real conversation about how to fund it sustainably, not just send checks and worry about the consequences later. The conversation around senior stimulus payments is ultimately a mirror reflecting our broader inability to address long-term challenges. We're a society that prefers immediate gratification over deferred maintenance. Whether we're talking about infrastructure, entitlement programs, or fiscal policy, a stimulus check feels good today. Reforming Social Security to ensure its solvency for the next 75 years requires tough choices that anger voters today for benefits they'll see decades from now. Which one do you think politicians prefer? Which one gets you reelected? So where does this leave us practically? If you're a senior watching this, wondering whether to expect a check and what it means for you, here's my guidance. First, don't count on it for planning purposes until legislation is actually passed and signed, because political promises and policy reality are often quite different. Second, if a payment does arrive, treat it as a windfall for specific needs or building emergency reserves, not as a permanent increase in your income level. Third, pay attention to what's happening with Social Security reform itself, because that matters far more for your long-term financial security than any one-time payment. And fourth, stay informed about the actual costs and trade-offs involved in these proposals, because understanding the full picture makes you a better citizen and voter. The stimulus check proposal reveals something important about where we are as a country. We're looking for easy answers to hard problems, for quick fixes to structural challenges, for political solutions to economic realities. Sometimes that works, but more often it just postpones the reckoning. And for seniors living on fixed incomes with limited time horizons and little margin for error, postponing the reckoning until the Social Security Trust Fund runs dry isn't just bad policy. It's a betrayal of people who built this country and deserve better than political theater disguised as real solutions.